Welcome back to another episode of I Wish They Knew, a show where we share big ideas that deserve more attention and about the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. I'm Joe Hirsch. Today's wish comes from Maria Ross. Maria is a speaker, author, strategist, and empathy advocate who has spent decades helping forward-thinking leaders and brands connect and engage through empathy. She's appeared in numerous media outlets like NPR, Forbes, Entrepreneur, and Thrive Global. And she's the author of not one, but two books. And the latest one is a good one called The Empathy Dilemma, just out: How Successful Leaders Balance Performance, People, and Personal Boundaries. Something we all could do a lot more of. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you here. So what do you wish more people knew?
I wish more people knew that they are not the only people in the world and that they can embrace empathy as a superpower and a strength, that it's not a weakness.
I think that'll come as a surprise to some people who understand this to be a character strength. True.
Mm-hmm.
What you've set out to do, though, in the book is to show that it's more than just a character strength.
Mm-hmm.
It's a leadership skill. And for the skeptics out there who see empathetic leadership as soft,
Mm-hmm.
let's go right to that. What would you tell them?
Yeah. And I think that's because people misunderstand what empathy actually means and how it shows up in the workplace. And my previous book, my third book that I wrote, The Empathy Edge, is the business case for skeptics on the ROI of empathy. It turns out empathy is not just good for society, it's great for business. And empathy, when you have an empathetic culture, when you have an empathetic leader, you boost engagement, performance, loyalty, you boost innovation, you boost customer loyalty and customer experience, and even customer revenue. So there's a lot of aspects to this, but again, it's about understanding what empathy is and what it isn't. And too many of us are telling ourselves a false narrative of what empathy looks like in the workplace. It's not people crying on the floor with their employees. It's 1,000 little easy things you can do as a leader, and some harder, to make people feel seen, heard, and understood. And you don't necessarily have to feel what they're feeling. You can use cognitive empathy and not emotional empathy. But when you understand their point of view, you actually get information. You get context. And with that information, you can move the conversation forward together for a mutually beneficial outcome.
Say more about that distinction between cognitive and emotional empathy.
One, we use our brain. One, we use our heart. So cognitive empathy is, I imagine what something might be like for someone. Maybe it's an experience I've never had. I've never been a refugee of a war. I've, never been an astronaut, but I can use my brain to imagine what that might be like. And maybe, this is where it gets in a little dicey, where you're making assumptions, but you can use your brain to say, what questions might that person have and what feelings might they be feeling? And then affective or emotional empathy is when I actually start to feel the feelings that you have. So you're anxious and upset, and my blood pressure starts to go up. My palms start to get sweaty, right? My voice goes into a higher register. So I start to feel what you're feeling. And cognitive empathy and affective and emotional empathy can both lead to taking an action, which is what compassion is. Compassion is actually empathy in action. Now that I know what you're thinking and feeling, what's our next right step to take together? And that could be listening. That could be giving you space. That could be maybe altering my decision or strategy going forward. Maybe not, but it gives me the opportunity to get the information I need. So with executives, I always say, think of it as being a detective and trying to figure out where someone's coming from.
So the leaders who manage to be both empathetic and effective and strike that balance, what are they doing differently than everybody else?
Well, that's why I had to write the second book, The Empathy Dilemma, because after years of research and hundreds of interviews, I sort of tried to decode the recipe of what was making some of these leaders really empathetic and their teams just love working for them. And they were high performers, right? They weren't lowering standards. They weren't skipping out on quality. They weren't burning out. And it turns out there's 5 pillars. There's 5 common threads among leaders that if they're able to be both effective and empathetic at the same time, it's self-awareness, self-care, clarity, decisiveness, and joy. And for some leaders, they might be really strong at all 5. Other leaders might start to realize and recognize, hey, I'm kind of weak in this area and this area. And that could be where the whole table's falling down for them.
So give us a drive-by of how all five of these things interplay with one another to produce this perfect balance between both empathy and effectiveness.
Yeah. Well, the first two have to do with getting your own house in order first and understanding how you show up into the interaction and what you bring. Because when we're tired, hungry, our needs are not getting met, we go into self preservation mode and we have no room to take on someone else's point of view without defensiveness or fear. So, self awareness is recognizing your strengths and your challenges and your emotional triggers, really doing some reflection, doing some self assessment, using tools like the Enneagram or Clifton Strengths Finder or Myers Briggs to really dig in and understand how you operate and what you bring to the conversation. And self care is about replenishing that tank. Because if you don't have the capacity, think about when you're tired and hungry, you're probably horrible to people, right? And it's the same thing, both physically and emotionally. Are we taking the time to recharge? Are we giving ourselves that grace and that space? How are we taking care of ourselves? Not massages and mani-pedis, but what is it that re-energizes us and helps us show up stronger in the interaction?
Yeah.
Clarity is about, you can't hold people accountable to an expectation you've never set clearly. So you need to be able to be clear in both how you communicate values, how you communicate norms, how you communicate expectations, and even career progression for people. Do they know what's next? Do they know what's coming? So are you a good leader where you're able to synthesize multiple points of view and swiftly make a decision? And then joy, which was the surprising one for me, but made sense, is that if you can bring levity and camaraderie into the team, people get to know each other. People trust each other. There's a lot of data around if you have a friend at work, you are more engaged, you are a higher performer, and you're less likely to be absent. So are you encouraging those personal connections? We don't have to let it all hang out, but do we actually enjoy being here even when the work might not be enjoyable? What are you doing as a leader to foster that?
Right. So your self-awareness and your self-care, that's what you're doing for yourself.
Mhm.
The decisiveness, the clarity, the joy, it's what you're really doing for others and what they need.
Yeah, it's kind of bringing that to the team environment and externalizing that a little bit more.
Interesting. So I'm thinking about those pillars in the
Mhm.
context of what it means to be a highly empathetic person. And I did come across one study that just gave me pause. And it went on to show that highly empathetic leaders who are giving critical feedback kind of fall into some sort of an empathy trap. That the more empathetic they are, the more they're aware of the negative emotions of others that may arise in the course of a negative feedback exchange.
Mhm.
And they're more likely to, so to speak, catch those negative emotions and take them closer to heart, which has
Mhm.
a downstream effect on their own effectiveness.
Mhm.
So, if we are those highly empathetic leaders, what do we do to protect ourselves?
I think that's why the pillars are so important because if that's happening to you, there's a big likelihood that one of those pillars is falling down for you. And so, kind of getting back to the cognitive versus emotional empathy, what is that interaction like where you're giving them the negative feedback? Are you turning that into a conversation where you're getting curious and trying to problem solve together with the employee about what could be improved, what could work better, finding out what they need, what their situation is? Versus are you just lambasting them, which I doubt if you consider yourself a highly empathic leader. But what is that interaction like? Is it actually a two-way interaction? Because if you are bringing it to the table in terms of this is the message I want to communicate and I need to communicate as a negative performance review, you actually aren't being empathetic. Because if you were, you'd be going into that going, I'm going to leave this person space to tell me what's going on for them and tell me what they think they need. And then we can have a conversation versus I'm going to be punitive about it. So I think part of that could be really, again, that misunderstanding of maybe that person initially is trying to turn off their empathy to
Mm.
protect themselves. And what comes out is something very negative and punitive because they're trying to shut down their emotions. So, Joe, I brought you here today because I need to tell you that you've missed these deadlines. And I'm trying to put my armor on because I haven't done the self awareness work on what my triggers are and what my strengths are. And now I've turned this into a one way interaction. And then when you react negatively to that, that is going to impact me. So
Hmm.
we need to take a look at what's going on around us and what we're actually bringing to the table. And that's why self awareness and self care are so important.
Yeah, if we just took a moment to sort of calibrate our own emotional state before going
Hmm.
into that conversation, we may be better prepared to handle what happens next.
Completely. And reframing it of like, okay, I know this person doesn't want to come to work and fail every day. So let's have a conversation about this.
A lot of this gets back to how we build up our own empathy muscles, is how you put it to me. And
Hmm.
I'm curious, how do we do that? Like, if someone wants to become more empathetic, but doesn't feel like they're quite there yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I love calling people out on I'm just not naturally empathetic because, as we were talking about, science has proven that we as humans are born with empathy. It just atrophies for some people over time, and notwithstanding some outlying psychopathies. But my first empathy book, The Empathy Edge, gave a lot of tips around how you can strengthen your own empathy and really do the reps. And you might feel sore the next day. It might feel uncomfortable. It's just like starting a new workout routine. So some of those things are, number one is learning to practice presence, which is related to self-awareness, but turning off your monkey mind and grounding yourself, maybe a 10-minute mindfulness practice a day, deep breathing before a contentious meeting, really just making yourself present in the situation so that I can actually see and understand you and not get caught up in just reacting or responding to you. The other is to get curious. And instead of just trying to come at you with everything I want to communicate, I need to understand your context. So get really good at asking questions. What might that person be thinking and feeling? Or how would I feel if I was in that situation? Or I didn't know that that was that kind of life experience. You start to flex that muscle in a safe environment. So when
Hmm.
you have to do it with a colleague or an employee at work, you start to get that into your default model of getting curious about someone right away.
Talk about some of the ways that we can measure the impact of empathetic leadership. Is this even something that can be quantified?
So my old answer used to be yes, if for your organization you've defined what empathy actually means and clearly articulated the actions and the behaviors that tell you, yes, this is empathy in action. Some companies call it different words. Airbnb, for example, calls it service. Other companies call it, integrity, whatever they're calling it. But I've changed my answer with further research because the point of this is that your outcome is not empathy. You don't want to just measure empathy because what if your numbers are in the tank, right? What if you're not making your quarterly goals or your KPIs for your organization? You want to measure what you need to measure to be a healthy organization. And then you want to inject and infuse empathy to get you closer to those goals. So empathy is a catalyst for you achieving your goals. It's not an outcome. So measuring empathy for empathy's sake, wow, we're a 100% empathetic organization, but we're declaring bankruptcy the next day because our products didn't actually sell. That's not going to help you. So you need to look at empathy as a lever towards reaching the goals that are measurable. And then you can put programs, you can put practices, you can put training in place to increase that empathy and then measure the impact on your goals of that over time. For example, if one of our goals is related to retention, when we start doing empathy training, when we start actually introducing that into our vocabulary, when we start preparing our leaders and helping them understand and model and reward it, do we see retention go up over time? Then yes, empathy has been effective in our organization. And you can do it externally too, as a brand, if you're trying to be more empathetic and connect and engage with your customers. Measuring results like customer experience surveys or customer satisfaction scores or repeat business. But you want to put those empathy practices and those empathy habits into place, do the training, do the work, and then start to see if the metrics that really matter go up.
So instead of choosing empathy adjacent targets and kind of artificially measuring those,
Mm-hmm.
measure what you measure,
Mm-hmm.
but infuse those measures with more empathy and see how that enriches the result.
Exactly. Put more empathy practices and training and reward structures, modeling into place, and then see how it impacts those measures. Because think about it, we don't measure respect in our organization. We have no measurement for integrity in our organization, yet those are all organizational values. It's about walking the talk and saying, does this impact what we're here to do? If it does, and the needle starts going up because we've put these things in place, we know that it's a result of the empathy that we're infusing into the organization and how people are collaborating better, which is what all the data show.
The book is The Empathy Dilemma, and the author is Maria Ross. Maria, thanks for sharing your wish with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.